distinguished guests, colleagues, ladies and gentlemen. So we are here for the launch of what we call the Inclusive Wealth Report 2014, produced primarily by two UN agencies, UNU, which is the United Nations University International Human Dimensions Program, which was the executive director before coming over to India, as well as UNEP, which is the United Nations Environment Program. And more recently, in collaboration with UNESCO, MGIEP, and a lot of other partners. We have the Ministry of Environment, Japan, who's a strong supporter. The Science Advisors Office of the Malaysian government was also a partner. The foundation is sustainable development. And the idea was to have a report to provide a strong theoretical and conceptual framework underlying the notion of sustainable development. If one looks at sustainable development that came up from the Brundtland Commission and later, it has a very nice definition, meeting the needs of the future with the present without compromising the needs of the future. But what was the conceptual framework here? And for many of us, there wasn't any. And a lot of the indicators that were developed to kind of monitor sustainable development were either very strong ecological, or in fact the social ones never actually addressed any of those issues. So this was the fundamental challenge. And we picked up some work that has been going on for not just a few years, many, many years, 20, 30 years. So the IWR provides such a framework. Now, the first report was released in 2012. 2012 for the Rio Summit in Rio. And we wanted to do a prototype, so we only did 20 countries. But together, these 20 countries had more than 50% of the global population, as well as more than 50% of the global GDP. So these were the big producers. At that point, then we decided that we should do this, but not on a yearly basis, but more every 2 years. And so here we are, 2014, with a 2014 report. It covers 140 countries, so we've gone from 20 to 140 countries. The focus of 2012 was on natural capital. The 2014 focus is on, and that's a very important component as well. When we talk about sustainability, we always tend to fall into the trap that it's just the environment. But here we want to emphasize that it's not just environment, but it also includes the social and the economic aspects as well. And you'll sort of see that emerging when we talk about the asset and the capital base. I see a real potential of the IWR to be a key educational resource tool. Something that we could use for our economic policy, but just not economics, but also the sustainability and other disciplines.
A pleasure to be here. Anant asked me to say a few words introducing the notion of inclusive wealth. Inclusive wealth is a measure of the productive capacity or productive base of an economy. And the question is, why are we interested in that? And particularly, it may be that you could say, yes, we want to measure something like the productive capacity of an economy, just as we talk about the productive capacity of a household. Why is this particular measure the right measure? When the word wealth is used, you know that we're looking at a stock, not a flow. So it's expressed in dollars or rupees, period. Whereas if it's an income, it's a flow, it will be rupees per unit of time. Okay. So that should immediately tell us something about the inadequacy of using flows for reflecting the future potential of the economy. Because the flow, by definition, unless it happens to be proportional to the stocks, that's a different matter. But typically, except in extremely unusual cases, they won't be proportional. So you could be misjudging what lies ahead if you look at only flows. So what are we interested in? We are interested in seeing whether, in some sense, human flourishing, if that's the end, human happiness, if that's the end, or human life satisfaction, if that's the end, or welfare, if that's the end, no matter what the end happens to be, whether that is sustained over time. Okay, now here's the theorem. The theorem says that no matter what your ends are, you could be a Buddhist, you could be a Christian, you could be, in other words, your notion of ends being influenced by Buddhist philosophy or Christian ethics or whatever, in conception of the afterlife and everything. No matter what the ends are, or whether you're an Aristotelian, there exists a measure of the productive capacity of the economy, such that if the productive capacity increases, either through policy or it increases over time, it will reflect changes in the corresponding changes in the ends that you have in mind. So if you targeted the right end, the right means for evaluating the ends, that's the idea. Turns out that it is inclusive wealth which has that property, and has that property uniquely.
Good morning, everyone. This is Shashi Tharoor, and I'm really sorry not to be with you physically, but only virtually. The principal purpose, of course, for sending you this message is to congratulate UNESCO's Mahatma Gandhi Institute for Peace and Sustainable Development, the United Nations University's International Human Dimensions Program and Global Environment Change, and the United Nations Environment Program, who've collectively invited me to be with you for successfully expanding the reach of the second Inclusive Wealth Report of 2014 from 20 countries in 2012 to 140 countries this year. This, to my mind, is a notable achievement, and I want to congratulate everyone involved in it. I do want to stress that, to my mind, the inclusive wealth idea is an extremely interesting one. It was first launched at the Rio Plus 20 conference, and it was presented to states as a way of measuring their wealth, growth, and societal progress in more inclusive and sustainable ways than the traditional measure of GDP. In fact, the Inclusive Wealth Index was created to complement the GDP by introducing the entire concept and understanding the impact and value of inclusive wealth, that is natural capital, human capital, and produced capital, which is not often adequately accounted for in the conventional measurements of GDP. Inclusive wealth, of course, reflects the social value of an economy's capital assets. We all know that GDP growth still dominates policy planning and implementation and even evaluation for countries at all levels of development. Yet we really have no way of knowing if GDP growth is sustainable. We don't know if it's inclusive, whether the activities that generate that growth will still be possible in 5 years or in 50. In fact, if you chop down a tree and sell the wood, you're adding to your GDP. If you plant a tree that will take 10 years to grow, you are not adding at all, which is contributing more in the long term, sustainably, to the nation's wealth. Obviously, the planted tree and not the chopped down one. So GDP alone cannot give us a measurement of that kind of investment. So once again, let me congratulate the UNESCO MGIEP, the UNU-IHDP and UNEP for bringing out this report.
Let me, at the outset, first of all, congratulate all the people who have been associated with developing this and the earlier report, because these represent major achievements in our state of understanding and knowledge on how this work should be done. And in that sense, they're like roadmaps of what is possible and what are things which we can do in ways to measure well-being, progress.
Inglawa, Namaste, good morning. It's an honor and privilege for me to be here, not only for the launch, but also the opportunity to share some of the thoughts and the relevance of the report to the reform process that is going on currently in our country. I really want to thank those that have produced the Inclusive Wealth Report, because it provides us with a policy roadmap. We will not need to follow the Washington consensus of focusing only on GDP growth. And therefore the report fits in very well with our current efforts, not only to achieve the MDGs by the end of 2015, but also to identify what are the SDGs.
Some of the main results. So this is the growth in GDP. Well, so the first one is 124 of the 140 countries experience a positive. Now, why 140? We actually had a much larger set. We had about 170 countries, I think. But to maintain consistency, because some of those countries they didn't have the data for certain aspects of the natural capital, or some countries didn't have something for the human capital, so we didn't want to put just blanks and then include them. So these 140 countries had consistency in the data that we were using throughout the analysis. So this first picture of the globe sort of tells you the countries 124. This is just basically the GDP. And then when you look at the wealth, you got 86 of 140 countries experience of positive growth in wealth. When we brought in the wealth, you got a significant change there. You got 86, so 104. If you look at GDP, 124 are doing well. At a global level, you say, hey, we are pretty much on a good track here. And when you get into the inclusive wealth, it just jumps down to 86 of those countries. Kind of shocker comes here, where more than half of the countries are consuming. This happens when we do the adjusted inclusive wealth. So with the three factors that we talked about, oil gains, TFP, carbon damages. The big factor here that caused these changes was the TFP. That was the major fact when you took a lot of these countries. And surprisingly, a lot of countries actually had negative numbers for their TFPs.
It is my honor and indeed my pleasure to talk about the IWR Human Capital Wealth Estimates. So here I am displaying the Barrow-Lee estimates a little bit differently. The green symbols are Barrow-Lee, ranked for the 18 countries. The bars are a lifetime income measure. My favorite, of course, being Jorgensen-Fermini. Now, I'm going to talk about this a little more shortly. But the IWR human capital estimates are also lifetime income measures. Now note that there's quite a significant difference in the ranking depending upon whether you use the average educational attainment numbers alone or you use a lifetime income measure. And the rankings differ by different types of countries.
Thank you very much for coming to this launch. Please download the report. Thank you very much.